Um, yes. So welcome and thank you everybody for having come today for my presentation. So the theme today is on museums post-pandemic. We all know that the pandemic has had long and deep impact on the world of museum, and unfortunate result has been the closure or downsizing of many museums all over the world. To survive post-pandemic, many museums need to change and be more aligned with the needs of society. That's my belief. So today I want to focus on the needs of immigrants, and I will look at how museums can better help with the needs of immigrants. So in our increasingly globalized world, unprecedented migratory phenomena have profoundly changed Western nations, not only in terms of volumes of immigrants, but also of diversity amongst and within those migrants, a phenomenon that Steven Vertovec calls super diversity. When dealing with immigration, most research on museums has focused on issues of representation of museums within the space of the museums, as well as issues of collecting and interpreting artifacts and collections involving those groups. Of course, issues of representation are very important, and I will go into that matter in a moment. Yet, more recently, a number of museums, particularly in Europe, have started to address the daily needs of immigrants by providing opportunities to learn the language of the host country, as well as providing employment and volunteering programs. The reason why I'm focusing on language and employment skills, because they have been heavily documented as being two of the core competencies that immigrants lack the most and have difficulties in acquiring. When I did my research, I realized there was really a little comprehensive and interdisciplinary research carried out on those recent programs offering opportunities for acquiring language learning and employment skills. And so that's what I decided to do, to focus on some of those programs, and I focus today on 3 European cities. Today, I'm also going to analyze how immigrants themselves have used selected museums in order to address issues of employment under their own terms, rather than under a museum's own term. So my paper is based on one of my books called Museums, Immigrants and Social Justice, published in 2017 by Routledge. So first of all, what is social justice and how do I define it? In my research, I use the definition of social justice as the capability approach developed by Professor Amartya Sen, a Nobel Prize winner in economics from India. A person's capability reflects the actual ability and freedom to choose to achieve what she wants to do and be. This approach relates to providing individuals with alternative opportunities and options from which they have the freedom to choose in order to be able to live the life that they have reason to value. According to this approach, goods, services, and resources are means to achieve what people want to be and do. They are not goals in themselves. So if we apply this approach to museum, then what I've been trying to do in my research is to analyze whether and how museums provide services, programs, and opportunities related to employment and language learning skills, which help individuals to improve their life choices. This approach also assesses whether museums are still neo-colonial and oppressive spaces that cannot be reformed because of structural and institutional barriers. And this is particularly what I look at in one of my case studies in France. So I focused in museums in Europe, as I said. So one of my first case was museums in Manchester in the UK, who had provided volunteering programs and employment-related skills for a diversity of participants, including immigrants, who have suffered from social and economic isolation. So this was the criteria for recruitment. In addition, Manchester Museum and Manchester Art Gallery, through the use of their respective collections, provide free English conversation classes entitled English Corner for adults who are speakers of other languages. I also analyzed programs in Copenhagen, at the National Gallery of Denmark, the nation's main museum of art, as well as its partner institution, Thorvaldsens Museum, which exhibits the artwork of Danish neoclassicist sculptor Bertel Thorvaldsen. These two institutions provided part-time paid employment for newly arrived immigrants who were Danish language students during the winter of 2013 and spring 2016. My final case study is the National Museum on the History of Immigration in Paris. I chose this museum because it was occupied by undocumented workers, most of them from French-speaking Africa, primarily from Mali and Senegal, from October 2010 to January 2011. So this is one of the longest unauthorized occupation of a museum. With this example from Paris, I was able to assess how immigrants have used the museum on their own terms to address issues of employment and discrimination. And that obviously also goes into issues of activism, which is very popular in the world of museum at the moment. So now let's look at some of the results of my research. Language learning is fundamental for building the capability of immigrants as it relates to being able to make sense of one's world in the host country, as well as expanding the different choices and opportunities available for individuals. I found that museums were quite good at complementing schools in language learning. This is primarily because the meaning of artifacts is not fixed, but is always open to interpretation. Such meaning emerges through a reflection between individuals using dialogues on artifact or as a self-reflection, taking shape from the materiality of the object and abstract thinking. For instance, a Latvian student found the process of learning a language in a museum very different than at school. According to her, in a classroom, you're always thinking about the grammar, and then whatever you say is secondary. However, in the workshop at the museum, she stopped thinking about the grammar to focus on her ideas and conversation. She recalled, and I quote her, "At one point, I was just sitting here and talking, just discussing something with the whole group, so in Danish, and being quite amazed at that and thinking, oh, I didn't know I could make sentences like that." Museums are also very good at bringing the outside in. They find out strategies where learners can bring into the class their everyday experiences, their life stories, or pressing issues that they are confronted with. Such experiences seem essential for language learning, as proven by previous research, such as that of Benham in 2007, which indicated that students are able to construct more complex sentences, undertake more complex thinking mechanisms, as well as speak more fluently when they can bring the outside in, but also when they can claim control of classroom discourse. This process of bringing the outside in occurred most clearly during an English corner session organized for a group of refugee women at Manchester Museum. I conducted interviews with these women 1 week after the session, and I found it quite telling that the first woman who talked to me was from Somalia and spoke almost solely about a ball from her community used as a handling object during the museum session. She obviously felt very proud that she was able to touch the object and explain to the group its different meanings and functions. So this Somali woman definitely brought the outside in during the English corner session, because the session was not supposed to focus so much on this artifact, but this woman was able to change dynamic completely. And she was able to bring in her own life stories and experiences related to this particular handling artifacts. Oh, sorry. Employment is a key element for building capability and agency, and is often the number one preoccupation of the immigrants I've met and interviewed in my project. I found that museums and their collections can be important tools to boost the self-esteem and self-confidence of immigrants. Let's take Manchester Museum again. As part of one of their volunteering program, participants had to act as volunteers in the galleries of the museum, working on the handling tables, where they were responsible for interacting with the public around one specific artifact they could handle. As stressed, for instance, by a recently arrived immigrant from the US, she said, when you are in the galleries, you are the expert, the knowledgeable one. It's almost like a high status profession. In addition, I found that museums were unique places to build or strengthen bridging and bonding capital, which can be essential to gain or regain employment. Bridging capital is inclusive, outward-looking, and leads to the development of a network of people who are outside of one's own community and across different social and economic divisions, and can help with finding jobs in particular, as is the case with museum staff. Bonding capital is characterized by exclusive and inward-looking social networks between a homogeneous group, including people with similar social and economic background and trajectory. This corresponded to some of the participants in the volunteering programs who faced similar hardship and health issues and could discuss them during this program as a way to combat their sense of alienation and isolation. But what have been the issues with this different program in Manchester and in Copenhagen? Most of the schemes that I've just presented excluded less privileged immigrants in socioeconomic terms, or those who are not fluent in the language of the host country, which is quite ironic because it's all around building competency in languages. Even when programs had been designed with less privileged immigrants in mind, for instance, refugees or asylum seekers, who did not necessarily choose to go, for instance, to England or Copenhagen, these people did not come to the museum on their own, as was noted, for instance, during the case studies and interviews at the free English Corner session at Manchester Museum and Manchester Art Gallery. So, for instance, the Somali woman I interviewed came up with her own class, and she's never been to the museum ever since, I believe, at least not when I was there. But it seems that this program attracts primarily immigrants who tend to be already familiar with museum, have relatively high levels of education, and are already fluent in the language of the host country. So to use Bourdieu's terminology, this is people with high economic and cultural capital. Another example is the IF Volunteering for Wellbeing program at Manchester Museum, which led in its first intake to the almost exclusive employment of native English speakers, most of them from the USA. So obviously this is not a fair representation of immigrants from the whole world. The first version of the employment of language students at Thorvaldsens Museum and the National Gallery of Denmark led to the almost exclusive hiring of well-educated individuals with a good knowledge of Danish. Obviously, museums cannot contribute to social justice if they only appeal to and involve narrow segment of society and have such an exclusionary approach to recruitment, even for their volunteering program. In addition, with such approach, museums continue to be spaces of distinction for the elite, as detailed in Bourdieu's research. This is not to deny that efforts have been made to attract and involve least privileged immigrants. Refugees and asylum seekers, for instance, were part of the target participants of the In Touch volunteering program at Manchester Museum, although they represented a minority of the selected participants. However, these less privileged immigrants tended to show slower progression and weaker outcome in language learning and in the acquisition of employment skills than other participants. The programs assessed in this research, which are short-term and intend to have significant impact fast, do not match the needs of those more vulnerable immigrants. Since leaving these programs, many immigrants have struggled to find opportunities to improve their competency, therefore running the risk of losing whatever they learn at the museum. And some of the data that I consulted was from longitudinal, quite long-term, at least 2 years analysis of participants in those programs. Hence, the language learning and employment program do not seem to address the long-term needs of less privileged immigrants. Besides, many immigrants did not attend the museum events that were organized for them. Surprisingly, the reason for this lack of participation in those events do not seem to have been fully addressed. Indeed, those exclusionary patterns could have diversity of causes, ranging from ingrained negative perception of the museum as colonial or neo-colonial spaces, or lack of time, or lack of childcare opportunities, etc. So since no research had been conducted, no corrective measure could then be taken. It is as though there was no real attempt to understand the causes and roots of these patterns, and no real will to change those exclusionary practices, which I found quite worrying. But all of those programs on employment and language learnings in Manchester, in England, and in Copenhagen, in Denmark, were very much implemented under the museum's own term. For this reason, I thought that the occupation by 500 undocumented workers of the Immigration Museum in Paris from October 2010 to January 2011 was an interesting additional example. So those 500 immigrants represented a wider group of more than 6,000 undocumented workers who had been working, some of them for as long as 10 years, in low skills and difficult professions, such as in catering, hospitality, construction, or cleaning. I won't go into the detail, but just to give you a background, the occupation corresponded to a protestation against the French government's failure to implement guidelines that provided simplified and unified criteria for the regularization of undocumented workers who had a work contract with an employer, either full or part-time. The aim of the occupation was also to negotiate the unified and harmonized treatment of regularization dossier and obtain the regularization of all working sans-papiers who fulfill the official criteria. So as you can imagine, because they're talking a lot about harmonized, unified, it is because everything was coordinated by a trade union called the General Confederation of Workers, in French, La Confédération Générale du Travail, in cooperation with 9 other organizations. So there's other trade unions, but there's also a lot of NGOs that militate for social justice. The museum was chosen as a symbolic space to link current immigration phenomena to historic one, and to demonstrate that present-day immigrants are making positive contribution to France through their work, the same way as previous waves of immigrants did. By occupying the immigration museums, these workers made the point that positive immigration is not only a phenomenon of the past as presented in the museum, but of the present as well. The occupation of such an open space also aimed to make the public realize the existence of these working immigrants, Indeed, most frequently, the term undocumented immigrant is associated with individuals fighting for their residence permit on humanitarian ground, particularly in Europe. I know in the US it's slightly different. The fact that undocumented immigrants can be workers with, for some, full-time contract is a reality that had been occulted up until this recent movement and occupation. The occupation of a public space, such as a museum, was one of the strategies used to popularize the existence of this disfranchised and exploited group. As part of my research, I wanted to understand how this occupation had been represented within the museum. Although there had been planned to do so, the occupation is not mentioned at all in the permanent exhibition that was revamped in 2014, so after the occupation. During my regular visit to the museum, I was continuously referred to a small glass cabinet away from the permanent exhibition, simply because the museum is a really, really big building. So there's lots of different rooms and some are really tucked away. And so the reference to the occupation is in a very, very small room, which is away from the main gallery. So a photo of the glass cabinet that was prepared about the exhibition is on the screen. The cabinet formed part of a wider display on the history and setup of the Immigration Museum, which the building itself dates from 1931. The conservator of the ethnographic collection who prepared this glass case stated to me during our interview that the cabinet's location made sense as the occupation was one event in the history of the museum. It thus needed to be presented in the section on the history of the museum. However, the peripheral location of the small cabinet and the lack of references to the working sans-papier movement in the permanent space of the museum also highlight the uneasiness of the museum staff to deal with this occupation, but also with contemporary migratory phenomena, which again is really ironic for a museum dealing with immigration. More than an uneasiness, this peripheral location also suggests a refusal on behalf of the museum to recognize the importance of the occupation and of the phenomenon of undocumented workers, maybe to respect the government's position, which founds this institution. And here we see a collision of interest between the noble aims of the museum, but it's the financial reality of the museum. But this can also be an understandable strategy of the museum to prevent any further occupation of this space in the future. So this approach by the museum resulted in some censorship, which is clearly visible on the screen with the choice of object displayed, which contain, so on the screen you see objects that were left by the immigrants at the forced end of the occupation. Some immigrants had to leave the museum with a one-day notice, not even so they couldn't take all of their personal belongings. So the object, as you can see on the screen, focus on the social, if I may say, aspect of the occupation, and include a teapot, a jerry can to carry water, a prayer mat, and a tape. Those objects were selected, I was told, because they illustrate how life in a community was orchestrated during the occupation. Sorry. However, this presentation is very biased and done in an unethical manner. First, it was prepared without the knowledge or participation of any immigrants. When I interviewed them, they all told me they were not aware of this glass case. Trade union, no trade union was aware of that, or no NGO was involved in the occupation, participated in this. So only the museum, and that's really problematic in the 21st century to do that. Second, no displayed artifact referred to the trade union or other organization which coordinated the movement, whilst immigrants left many leaflets, badges, and stickers displaying their logo. The display does perpetuate the traditional stereotyping image of immigrants as non-workers, detached from politics, and lacking any substantial network of support. In terms of results, so moving away from just representation, the occupation helped to speed the delivery of residence permit, which is good. Yet the main goal of the movement was to obtain a common and harmonized approach to the treatment of all regularization dossiers. However, official figures after the occupation reveal some arbitrariness in the treatment of this dossier, particularly by those who occupy the museum. And so there have been further strikes, and you may have heard recently that there were strikes by women, because what I looked at was primarily done by men, and they had a massive success recently with having their contract renegotiated and getting employment rights and everything, which was good, although they didn't occupy a museum. I'm just saying that those strikes are continuing all over France and primarily Paris. So in conclusion of my book, it proposes a number of suggestions for change or areas for further research. One suggestion is to encourage activists to make museums more accountable if their mission and goals are to further social justice and inclusion. And we've seen a lot of leaflets around social inclusion, especially recently following the Black Lives Matter movement. As I explained, this was clearly one of the aim of the occupation of the Immigration Museum. That was to ensure that the museum's goal to represent immigration positively are actually fulfilled. And we saw how difficult it was for the museum to actually fulfill their goals because of some of the financial constraints in particular. In addition, museums need to understand better the needs of immigrants and how to respond to these needs in a more sustained manner. More research needs to be undertaken on the reasons why immigrants from certain backgrounds do not participate in museums activities, especially when these activities have been designed primarily for these groups. Future funding schemes also need to recognize the multiple forms of exclusion suffered by immigrants and to provide comprehensive approaches to addressing them. So here I'm thinking in particular about the fact that funding schemes tend to be very short, so programs tend to be very short and they don't address the long-term needs of immigrants. My research has also explained that the social role of museums is still marginalized in too many institutions. For this reason, each individual has a role to play in promoting museums as spaces of social justice, including through using social media to raise relevant issues, to publishing critical research, or in helping organizations to use the space of the museum to gain rights for working and other immigrants. My book might be a small contribution to making museums more aligned with the social justice agenda, and maybe your work might also be. Thank you for having listened to me.